session. So first I'll introduce Dr. Chella for all the attendees here. So Dr. Sudhir Chellarajan, he's a prominent professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. And he previously served as the department head for some time, and he was one of the founding coordinators of IGCS, which is Indo-German Center for Sustainability, a collaborative research and training initiative between IITM and some German universities. He holds a PhD in environmental science and engineering from the University of California, Los Angeles. So his research interest spans across disciplines like political theory, environment justice, climate ethics, sustainable development, and governance. And also partly focusing on how technology and policy intersect with equity and democratic practices. So before joining IIT, he held positions at the Toulouse Institute in Boston and UNDP in New York. And recently, I think in 2020, he wrote a book, A Social Theory of Corruption, Notes from the Indian Subcontinent. So I'll let him discuss more parts of this book in his presentation. But the key theme discusses how corruption is not just about illicit transactions and a sort of questions of personal ethic, but is also deeply intertwined with social hierarchies, cultural practices, and institutional norms. So he conceptualizes corruption as a systemic and cultural phenomenon embedded within the social structure rather than just a sort of personal act. So I think I'll let him speak now, and I assure you that will be very interesting. Some of the ideas that he talks about in his book. So, Dr. Chella, we can start now.
Thank you so much, Abhinita. Really pleasure to be here and to see you again. So let me dive straight into the presentation. So I teach, as Abhinita says, in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. And I'm also associated with something called the Peri-Urban Initiative. I won't be talking about it today, but maybe in the discussion, if you like, I can say something about that. So when we think about corruption, one of the big questions is, what exactly are we talking about? For the most part, we have the ability to recognize corrupt practices when we read headlines, but we're not actually able to make an easy definition of corruption. Now, it turns out that there's a whole sort of an official kind of discipline of corruption studies. And the standard definition, which has made a lot of people in the field very uncomfortable, is that corruption is the abuse of public power for private gain. That is, somebody who is entrusted with doing some official act, a bureaucrat, a minister, somebody else, abuses that office to make money for himself or herself. And indeed, look at some of these headlines. A number of these headlines seem to reflect that, right? The second bullet point, Nigeria's former oil minister lost $20 billion on her watch. When she was oil minister, somehow supposedly 20 billion US dollars went missing, right? So clearly she was involved in pocketing some of that money. But since the amount is so large, we must also be fairly certain that a lot of other people also, pocketed some of this money, right? Then the first headline, from the Pentagon to the private sector. This is actually describing a phenomenon that is fairly frequent. People who work in the government sector, the government sector, particularly in establishments like the defense departments of various countries. But the US has the largest defense budget in the world, probably 10 times the budget of many other countries, including India's and so on, larger than any other, the next few countries combined and so on, right? And the Pentagon officials are routinely contracting out their projects, the procurement and so on, to the private sector. So when you see a headline like this, somebody who used to be in the Pentagon, somebody who used to be, in charge of these defense contracts, going out and then becoming a contractor. This is called a revolving door phenomenon. So it's not quite the abuse of public office for private gain, but in a sense it is. I mean, in a broader sense it is, right? Then the third headline, how industry transforms our scientific understanding of risk. This is even more insidious because what you're seeing here, and this is referring to the pesticides and chemicals industry in the US again, where the chemicals industry, particularly pesticide manufacturers and so on, they sent their so-called experts into various committees that were making assessments of risk, whether how to define risk, how to define which chemicals are risky, et cetera, et cetera. So you see there's some conflict of interest here that underlies this kind of headline. So when you see examples like this, you have to wonder, okay, what might be going on, even if it's perfectly innocent. You want people from industry to be involved, but if they start making decisions on how they themselves should be regulated, then that's a problem, right? The fourth headline is very similar. Interpol got into bed with FIFA. Everybody knows FIFA, the football association that gives us the most thrilling games every few years. And we also are aware of the massive scandals associated with FIFA. So if a police agency is involved with, again, an agency that is involved, I mean, supposed to be completely neutral, supposed to look at transnational crime and take care of these things. If you see instances where they have been involved, quietly on the side with FIFA, that poses a big problem, right? And then so on and so forth. I'm not going to read the other two headlines, but you should sort of get the message from this, that corruption involves something over and beyond just individuals who are accepting bribes, giving bribes, or things like that. What this picture here on the inset on the slide is showing you is actually from a series of videos from Peru. These are called Vladi videos, VLADI videos. And it refers to this person, this person here, Vladimir Montesinos. He was a police chief, and he had a series of meetings, and he used to be the police chief under Fujimori. Fujimori was the president of Peru between 1990 and 2000. And he used to have a series of meetings every single week, perhaps, in hotel rooms with various very powerful people in industry, in government, in the media, foreign companies, from foreign governments, from the military, various contractors, and so on. So we had over 350 such meetings that we know of. We know of these meetings because he videotaped every single meeting. And in each of those meetings, either he was giving money to somebody or he was receiving money from somebody, right? So these meetings, some of these videos are freely available on YouTube. So you'll be able to see, at least, I mean, even though they're in Spanish, you'll be able to understand that these are all corrupt transactions taking place. And what this signifies, what this particular activity signifies, and I'll be talking a little more about that later, it signifies that it's not just individuals, but it's powerful individuals in key positions negotiating with other powerful individuals in other key positions who are making side deals that somehow support those elite groupings at the expense of the larger public, right? So in a sense, if we start thinking about corruption not as an individual bad actor or bad actors, even in a group, but as a sort of a network effect of elite groups working together, then because we have such a wonderful broader understanding of social networks, and the sociology associated with social networks, we can actually develop some interesting ideas from this understanding of corruption. So let's go back to some basics. If you think about meanings and definitions, uh, corruption is a very old word, as it turns out, right? And the English word corruption comes from this old English word karump. And karump means to decay, to become rotten, to have something sort of falling apart, right? That's karump. Bhraштাচার, we all know that word as well. And that also indicates decay, degenerate customs, practices, institutions that are falling apart, and so on. The Chinese word fubai, same thing, the idea of decay and rottenness. The Tamil word ural, also rotten, right? You can say that food goes ural, which means food gets spoiled, right? And so corruption was always and has always been understood in terms of some kind of societal decay. Right? Now, this is important because we seem to have had a collective understanding of corruption that was lost in this official definition, which is the abuse of public office for private gain. Right? Even though it's a useful definition, it can give us an understanding of how bribery affects basic services. Bribery is used to change regulations. It is a theft of state resources. When people like ministers and bureaucrats and so on start stealing from government resources, they are reducing the amount of money available for development. It also changes the nature of the bureaucracy of government servants. People lose trust in the system, and it can affect all kinds of other uh, organs of government, particularly when it affects the judiciary or the military. These things become very, very worrisome for the country as a whole. So if in fact, in Argentina several years ago, the judiciary was so corrupt that some scholars who are studying corruption in Argentina would say, well, it's better to abolish the judiciary rather than to keep it going. Because if you keep it going, you're basically having these judges continue to be corrupt, and they're also, in a sense, threatened by the powerful. So the gangsters and other criminal elements would essentially say, well, either you give us the favorable judgment or we're going to kill you. And a lot of judges were shot dead. So these are all so you can see how corrupt practices affect not just particular parts of government or particular institutions, but can affect the whole of society and transform the whole of society. Right. So that's important to bear in mind. So even the official definition, when you look at the cases more carefully, you start to see the social understanding, start to gain the social understanding of corruption. Now, let's start making some other distinctions. And I want to talk now about petty corruption, administrative corruption, and what I call grand corruption. Right? This is a common understanding now of corruption, that you have to think about different scales of corruption. So petty corruption is what most of us in developing countries like India, if you go to Nigeria, if you go to even Tajikistan, countries in transition, across the world, you will find this kind of a scene. Well, somebody who has official power, usually a street level bureaucrat, right? Somebody you encounter in our everyday encounters, like on the street or somewhere else, typically a policeman, or if you're traveling from one country to another, at the border, the customs official, etc. Right? See, these are bureaucrats that the public generally encounter, and so when we pay these individuals who act as gatekeepers to bigger offices, we might pay them either to permit us to do something that we shouldn't be doing, or to do something that we normally would not have to pay for, right? So both kinds of activities might involve an additional transaction, right? So it's like you pay to avoid a penalty, or you pay to get something illegal done. Either you're in the wrong, or the police official or bureaucrat is in the wrong. But either way, you end up making a payment. So it's a very direct transaction, but it's also called sometimes retail corruption. So you can understand why it's called retail corruption. It's happening between a consumer and another actor. Now, this is in contrast with what has now been well established as administrative corruption. Administrative corruption is when these kinds of petty bribes are now semi-official, meaning a government agency, let's say the Land Records Office in a particular district, right? They might say, well, in order to become an official here, you have to pay a bribe of so much to so and so, right? And then once you have paid that bribe, you have only 3 years or 5 years to recover all that money, right? So you need so there's a sort of a market mechanism that is set up to ensure that this is what happens. And a good example of that is over here, right? This comes from the newspaper. It's basically showing how in Tamil Nadu, the police for all these different actions, to settle a civil dispute, if you're dealing with a sub inspector, to settle a civil dispute, right? You pay the sub inspector anywhere from 5,000 to 20,000. For the inspector, 10,000 to a lakh, right? For the station writer, for issuing of normal things, NOC, passport verification, driving license, 500 to 1,000. So it's a gradated scale that they provide. They've established, and these are fixed amounts, more or less, right? Even though they don't have a physical card like this. This is something that the newspaper produced. You can well imagine that everybody in that in a particular region or whatever would have open knowledge. How much do you have to pay in order to get this job done, right? So this is also sometimes known as machine politics, and it comes from an old system, a system that precedes independence in India. It actually happened during the 19th century in New York, in the state of New York. So the state of New York was extraordinarily corrupt, right from the governor all the way down. And in the administrative system of New York, or the city of New York in particular, you had a boss in charge, you had other ward bosses, and then the police and others, precinct captains. They're all sort of part of that network, right? And in order to get any job done, any government job done, you had to sort of negotiate your way through all these people. So you had to, if you had money, you could buy those things that you wanted. And the politicians who got elected themselves use that money for their political campaigns and so on. So it was a kind of a very smooth and well-established corrupt system, right? So this is known as administrative corruption. And it took many decades of lots of hard work and political work in order to address these issues. It was not until the early to mid 20th century that this level of corruption in New York. New York was not the only place, but it was very obvious. It was the most famous and egregious case of such machine politics. So it took a long time for this to go away. At an even higher level is something that people call grand corruption. And grand corruption happens, you might say, at the level of a national government or even in international agencies. It's a transnational activity. But the best way to think about grand corruption is to look at what has happened in the past in I mean, and continues to happen in the country of Russia, right? So Russia, since the around the early 2000s, around the time Putin came to power, you had a series of oligarchs controlling the entire economy. These were oil and telecom oligarchs. You know, a small group of individuals owned the majority of the country's economy, right? It was really controlled by a handful, fewer than 10 or 12 individuals who had, control over, say, 70, 80% of the economy. And this is because they controlled all the major energy resources, they controlled telecom, they controlled all the infrastructure of the country, and they were handpicked by Putin and his team, right? And so they had a very close synergy for a long time. It's not that they didn't develop tensions with each other. I think Netflix had a series on Khodorkovsky. He was one of the oil executives who, went out of favor with Putin and, was jailed. Various other things happened. He wrote a book. He became famous, but he also kind of revealed his own complicity in sort of promoting this. So in a sense, this extortion of politicians from big business, so they would get money for their campaigns and activities, but that also meant that big business sort of owned some of the politicians. They had some control over what policies the politicians would build. So you see grand corruption as a way of actually changing legislation, changing the very foundational institutions of a country, right? So today, what's happening in the United States under the Trump regime, one can see the beginnings of this kind of grand corruption. It's becoming very blatant. It's becoming very obvious. And the US had a lot of institutions to sort of guard against this. That's why you have what's known as a separation of powers. You have all of these other ways of trying to reduce or curb the extraordinary sort of power of a small group of individuals, whether it's big business or politicians or the media or anything else, right? So you have these checks and balances, but those are also sort of dissipating, I would say, in the US. In Russia, they have been largely sort of overcome. Not entirely, but they're largely overcome. And so this is a very despairing situation in a country like Russia. Right? And there's also another wonderful Netflix series called The Mechanism, and that's showing what this particular diagram is expressing. It has to do with Petrobras. Petrobras is the major oil company. It's a public sector oil company in Brazil, and how they were tied up with engineering companies, money launderers, politicians, and political parties across the spectrum. So regardless of which political party came into power, this cycle continued. So this is another instance of grand corruption. So if you watch that series Mechanism, you'll see how intricate some of this becomes, and how sort of sustained, how it completely transforms a particular country and society, right? So now that we have a sense of these three broad levels of corruption, it's useful to understand something that political scientists have known about for a very long time. It's called a patron-client relationship, sometimes also called clientelism, etc. And what does that mean? It simply means that in a very simple way, somebody with a higher socioeconomic status, like a patron, somebody who's, this is something that you've seen in lots of feudal situations as well, right? Somebody who is wealthy, a wealthy individual in a community will say, "Well, I'll take care of you," right? And so the person to whom this individual is providing these benefits feels very grateful, feels very loyal to, and so on, and also gets some protection from, right? So what will that person do? That person will is almost assured as a supporter of this more powerful individual, right? Now, this might be a very innocent relationship. It might not seem to be very harmful, but when this is cultivated and when this is part of political processes and political campaigns and so on, this leads to great harm. I won't go into the various features of clientelism, but if you look on Wikipedia or elsewhere on what this term means, you will see a lot of examples of how this causes harm, right? But this approach, so there's a person-to-person linkage that is important in clientelism. So these person-to-person linkages also gives us some understanding of the kinds of networks that are involved, right? So it's important to understand. So I'm going to do a slight detour to just go into social network analysis very briefly. I'm not going to go through each of these examples. But what this is basically showing you is different ways in which individuals can be connected to each other in various configurations in what's known as through network diagrams like this, right? So each circle is an individual, and these are connections that these individuals have with each other, right? So in this particular example, the first one shows that this individual is connected to four individuals. This person is only connected to one individual, right? So the green person has what's called a high clustering coefficient. And this, you can also see the same thing here. It's also called a closeness centrality, right? There are other different terms that people use, degrees of betweenness centralities. So I just say something about betweenness centrality because that's important. So this person here is connected to two groups of people, at least, right? So what that means is this person can't get connected to this person unless they go through the person with the high betweenness centrality, right? So we know those situations very well. In order to get some job done, you have to know the right person, and that person has a high betweenness centrality. So in political networks, if you think about grand corruption, for instance, there's a small number of brokers in grand corruption who have very high betweenness centrality. And those are the people who control these networks. So corruption networks tend to be, in social network terms, sparse networks. They're not very crowded networks. We don't have an example of a crowded network here. Maybe this one a little more, right? I mean, the people all, most of these people are connected to each other, etc., right? But not so in these. So let me show you an actual example. This is from work done by one of my former PhD students, Aishwarya Raman, and she looked at two different types of farmer networks, farmer producer corporations, they're called, right? And so the one on the left, just say that there's FPC1 and this is FPC2. The one on the left looks very different from the one on the right, correct? I mean, apart from the color coding and all that, I'm not going to describe those. But each of these is an individual, right? And so here, these individuals in blue are connected to a lot of people. A lot of these people are connected to a lot of people, right? But whereas here, you see people in this corner, that corner here, and this corner are not very well connected at all. And then there are a few individuals here who have high betweenness centrality, meaning they are the brokers, they are the agents. In order to, if you're a farmer here or if you're a farmer here, then there's nobody really to help you because you don't even have connections to this network. But if you're a farmer here, then you'll have to go through this agent, and then maybe through this agent, let's assume that this person is a distributor and this person is a farmer, or this person is a farmer. they have to go through a lot of brokers and agents in order to get to their right distributors, or if there are other distributors here, maybe they'll get it through there, right? But you see what kinds of problems these issues, these kinds of network structures create. Whereas here, the connection between this person and this person is not so complicated, not as complicated. I mean, it might be a little difficult, but not necessarily as complicated. And there are many others here who are even better connected, right? So that's something to bear in mind. The one on the right, incidentally, was largely women-owned, largely consisting of small farmers, all working through self-help groups and so on. These had both big and small farmers and marginal farmers, but they had a traditional hierarchical structure, right? This FPC and this FPC. So let me pause for a moment and see if there are any questions or comments, because I know I've been talking and it's a little difficult to do this without any feedback or response from an audience. So are there any questions or thoughts before I proceed? I don't see any comments or hear any voices, so I'm going to continue.
No, I think you can continue. Maybe at the end of it, they can ask questions.
Sure. Okay, so let me go back to this part, because I'm starting on something slightly different. I'm going back in time to ancient civilizations, and this little history lesson is basically to remind ourselves that not so long ago, about 5,000 years ago, I don't know what the human population was. Some estimates are it's about 100 million, I think. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's I think in this period, human population was around 100 million. But you should know for a fact that 100 million people were not there in the Indus Valley, the Huanghe Valley in China, the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, or the Nile Valley. These were the only places which had groups of people operating like they belonged to some social order, right? There was some kind of a social ordering. We don't have much evidence from all these places. There's archaeological evidence, but we don't have much written material from the Indus Valley, from Harappa and Mohenjo-daro and other areas in that region. We don't have any. The script has not been deciphered, so we have no true history or knowledge of what they were like. But what we do know is more than half the Earth's population lived outside these places, which we today would call states or polities. It means some kind of way of ordering people into following some pattern, right? And how do we know that? We largely know that from the archaeological record. Because during this period, there were very large numbers of people who left other kinds of imprints, other kinds of records. In Bhimbetka, in Madhya Pradesh, we have wonderful records of evidence of that in India. In other parts, large parts of Africa, we have that. All over South America, all over North America, Mongolia, China, etc. Right, and even Australia. There are lots of communities of people who were nomadic, who lived outside of areas where they had to settle down. And these were also areas where people settled down, and there were towns and cities in these areas. So that should tell us something about these places. And what we know most about, what we have the most evidence about among those 4 places I mentioned, is the Nile Valley. The Nile Valley, we have like a 2,500-year record, both a written record because their script Their cuneiform has been interpreted, has been translated into various languages, and we have a lot of archaeological record. What we do know is that we had in this vast region uh, empires, Egyptian empires, forming several dynasties that were near continuous for nearly 2,500, 3,000 years, right? They were, we know that they built these beautiful pyramids, they did all these other things, but we also know a very kind of excellent understanding of their hierarchy, right? And this is the typical hierarchy. We had servants and slaves. These were at the bottom of this pyramid. They served everybody. We have no idea of you know, how they lived, but we have some evidence that they were they led the least the most miserable and the hardest lives, right? And at the top were these people, the senior officials, the high priest, the nobles, and of course the pharaoh himself, right? And there were others also who had slightly more comfortable lives, right? So this is the part that we understand about this area. How was life outside of Egypt during this period? Well, to the west was the desert, so people couldn't actually leave Egypt to go into the desert unless they went with great difficulty. And more increasingly, what archaeologists and historians and other scholars, Egyptologists and others are coming to a consensus on is that this group, in particular, the peasants, farmers, servants, and slaves, were trapped in this region and they were forced to work in this manner, right? For these, so you have the sense that this was actually a kind of a sparse network where these groups in particular had the control to manage and make these people entirely dependent, right? So when you look at those network maps, what you also understand, I forgot to mention this in the previous network map, this Aishwarya also found something that was important. She found that during the pandemic, this was the group, the one on the right, was the group that was the most resilient. They didn't have food shortages. They had various kinds of ways in which they managed things, etc. Whereas this group had a lot of difficulty. You know, a lot of farmers, you know, especially in the outer edges and all that, had difficulty. They either couldn't get paid for their food or they themselves didn't have much to eat. So in a sense, when you have sparse networks, you're also trapped in that network. You don't have, under conditions of crisis, under conditions of difficulty, you don't have the ability to sort of be flexible, to be resilient, right? And this is also something that we know about what happened in ancient Egypt. This is from ancient Harappa. This is, I'm not going to say anything about it other than that this is a great mystery. Unlike Egypt, we don't have much sense of the hierarchy in Harappa. We don't understand how it worked, but I'm not going to say much more about that. But the broad argument I'm trying to make from just that one example, the Egypt example, is that you have what are known as territorial regimes, where which are dependent on settled populations within a somewhat well-defined area, right? These were also areas which grew grains. What kinds of grains? Initially wheat, various forms of millet, barley, and so on. And then in certain areas which managed to develop, which discovered wet paddy, you had paddy. Dry paddy had a different history, and I won't go into that, right? But the agricultural revolution is really a grain revolution around wheat, barley, millets, and especially rice, right? Because these were grains that could be stored for a long period of time, and the farmers became sort of tied to the land. They were sort of trapped in social relationships on the land, and they were forced to provide some kind of protection, some kind of tribute. So there was a kind of a clientelistic patron-client relationship that developed between the landowners and the peasants, or the kings and the peasants, or somebody else, some tax revenue collectors and the peasants, right? And so these networks became somewhat elaborate and well established. So the other thing I forgot to mention is, once you develop this network structure, once you have a particular type of network structure, that network structure tends to be resilient, doesn't change very fast, right? Why? Because if you have a gatekeeping function, then you would want to protect that gatekeeping function, because you get so many advantages from that. States of Malacca in Asia, there have always been pirates, pirate kings, and various others who would always raid ships going through that. Why? Because they knew they had control over that region, and they did everything they could for centuries to try and consolidate that power. So, so these, what one might call strategic interests, became the sort of ways in which these social structures and cultural varieties developed, right? So this is something that if you're trained in sociology, you should have no difficulty understanding. If you're not trained in sociology, you might say, wonder what is going on, right? But in a sense, these things evolve, take shape, and they gain some kind of what's known as path dependency, meaning they crystallize, they become particular forms of social structure, right? And so this is why over the past several centuries, we've had this figure of the king, the Raja, right? So territorial parts of the world, and India became very much a territorial entity around the time of the Guptas. Not so much during the Mauryas, but by the time of the Guptas, we started becoming more and more territorial entities. Similar, China had been territorial for much longer, right? Then in Egypt, it kind of ended by the time of the first millennium, and then the Romans took over. Then the other kinds of territorial entities took place there, etc., etc. Right? So, but in all of these places, you had one person who was the pharaoh or the king or the Raja, the Maharaj or the Badshah, who ended up for centuries after that becoming this resplendent figure, this person who everybody would look to, right? And this, again, in sociology, you would call a symbolic entity, right? Somebody who sort of had the maximum amount of symbolic capital. So, so that almost like a god. In fact, in many parts of the world where there were kings, this was the person who was endowed with being almost like a representative of a god himself, almost always a man, almost also always, therefore, a paternal figure, therefore also somebody who you could model your nuclear family on, to have the similar characteristics. So whole series of social learnings come from just this development of kingship, right? So I'm going to skip over this, but it's there in our in many of our epics, right? This idea of the mythical condition of so this in Shanti Parvan in the Mahabharata, you see Arjuna saying to Yudhishthira, nowhere do we see wealth that was not acquired through plunder. The royal sages who have attained heaven describe this as dharma, right? So it's basically that this king is seen as our dharma, worshipping a king, having somebody who gains wealth through war, through plunder, through various kinds of accumulation of control and power, etc., is sort of valorized. How much time do I have, Abhinita?
I think 10 minutes, it's about 25, maybe 35, by 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, fine. So then let me go past all this, because there are other features of this that I wanted to talk about. But let me move on to this example, which I already mentioned, right? This is Montesinos. Montesinos is this police chief of Fujimori, who was the president of Peru, 1990 to 2000. And I showed you that, if you remember, I showed you that clip from a photo from a clip that he himself had shot. And that's at the center here. And these were all the different types of groups with whom he maintained his relationship. So, because I'm trying to come back to that theme again, that clientelism, this way of sort of controlling, creating sparse networks, trying to make sure that you have access to key individuals in key places and key parts of this vast, complex network. You know, if you're the head of a government, even a government that isn't as large as India, a government like Peru, you have a very large number of things that you could be doing. But to be smart about creating these strategic links and to pay those people strategically was something that was perfected here in this instance, right? And what those kinds of patterns apparently are also show up in a vast number of things around the world. So the financial world is extremely sparse, has a very sparse network. It is what accounts for the fact that there are a few individuals who are billionaires. Not everyone is a billionaire. Not everybody who gets an MBA and goes into finance is a billionaire. Not even everybody who has vast family wealth and then gets into business, becomes a billionaire or stays a billionaire, right? So there's really a very strategic kind of interlocking relationships. And there's a TED talk by this person, Gladfelder. You can look for it and you'll find it. And it's called "Who Controls the World," I think. And he describes this particular diagram, and he explains how you get to this. And he shows how these very sparse networks, these elite networks of global wealth, form and get and gain control. And it's not accidental that governments are influenced by this. So what is the problem with this? What's the problem with a small number of people controlling the world? Well, it's because they have undue influence on social and public policy in many countries. So this graph on the bottom is showing from 1950 onwards to 2018. The red line is the effective corporate tax rate. So the corporate tax rate is going down, which means companies, even as companies are getting more sparse, the smaller number of companies controlling, a larger number of things. There's only Netflix, Amazon Prime, and something else, right? Controlling all the OTTs. There are a few monopolies in almost every sector. You take pharmaceuticals, you take telecom, you take everything else, right? Retail, car services, whatever you take, you see a small number of corporations. And as these corporation networks are getting more sparse and few controlling entities are there, the corporate tax rate has been coming down dramatically in the US. And instead, the payroll tax rate, that is, what the equivalent of the income tax rate, that is actually sort of going on. So the government is having a fiscal crisis, not able to gain enough revenues because they're not able to, they're being influenced in such ways that they can't, gain enough taxes from corporations. So there are impacts on gender. I'm not going to spend time on that. This is just a cover of my book where I look at some of these issues, not all of these, but I sort of get into that a little bit. And then I also describe in that book different types of elite groups in different parts of the long history of India. Right. So if you're interested, you can take a look at that. But let me try and wrap up in the next 3-4 minutes. Right. So what are the learnings in the so elite networks have a kind of a social structure. They become consolidated, and they have, you can also think of them as having operating at different scales uh, in different times, right? So for instance, if you think about the long history of empires, you have these elite so the ancient Egypt, I mentioned 2000, 2500 years, right? So those kinds of legacies went on for a very long time. If you look at ancient Rome, right? Rome was an empire from around 300 BC to around 600 AD. A few family names are very prominent throughout that history, right? There are 4 or 5 family names. You know that from the last names, the surnames of these families. And you'll see them, many of them become emperors, become other people, they become notorious, something else, etc. Right? So that is one scale at which you can look at these elite networks. Then I showed you this FPC network, right? The Farmer Producer Corporation network. Those networks are much more limited in a few years, for maybe one generation at the most, right? You have these networks, then they might shift again, right? Or again, it depends. But some of them tend to be resilient, and we don't know which ones are. We need to do more research. We need to try and understand their morphology, right? We need to understand what kinds of opportunities for gatekeeping, what kind of physical violence and extortion is used. The case of Indonesia under Suharto, right? There's a terrible violence and terrible effects of those elite networks in that country. And Suharto himself personally got some 45 billion US dollars, right, for himself over 30 years. And and then you also have to start thinking about other social elements, right? Including family structure, the role of legacy capital. How does generational wealth continue? In certain societies, Europe in particular, Thomas Piketty has shown that, since the 16th, 17th centuries, in certain parts of France, family legacies and generational wealth has continued. Right? So the CEOs of certain corporations in France, their history goes back, for 300-400 years, right? And similar things you see in it changes social life, it changes family life. So there's another book that I would strongly recommend by Ross Douthat, Douthat, and the book is called Privilege. It came out, I think, in 2002, and he talks about his time at Harvard University and how, again, these elite networks were formed and how they became very important because some of the same people became, CEOs of Goldman Sachs, something else, etc. Right? And they were all connected, or some big law firm, etc. In India, we have this phenomenon with Doon School. I'm sure many of you know. I think they're called doughboys. And if you look at doughboy networks, you'll see again they hold very prominent positions in small groups, right? And so trying to understand this sociologically is a very complex phenomenon. You come face to face with things that are sometimes uncomfortable to face, and so on. But they make up what are known as cultures, and so I'll stop over there. So corruption is tied to the formation of social life and our cultures.
Thank you so much. I think that was, I wish should have had more time to discuss this. I think you have to skip over quite a number of slides so that you can accommodate with our timing. But thank you so much. That was very informative and insightful. I found this work by Aishwarya very interesting, the color-coded networks and all, and how that sort of shows us in ways in which everyday practices of corruptions are also legitimized, and then it is embedded into certain social structures. So I think basically what you're saying is that also, in some ways, be it through elite networks or in everyday life, there is also a certain turning away of blind eye to corruption, so that there can be a legitimacy because certain kind of people and maybe incomes and economic networks work when there is some amount of corruption operating in society.
Yes,
So
yeah,
now
absolutely.
I
Yeah.
yeah. So now I'll ask if anyone. I'll just ask the attendees and also among the panelists if anyone have any questions or any other insight, or they feel that something else would have been part of this discussion. Please go on. Maybe you can take all the questions together and answer if there are questions on this. Yes.
Yeah. I think I may have overwhelmed people with too much information. So this is always a challenge.
No, I think many of the attendants here also, for them also corruption and this talk is also quite new. Because when we're teaching development or topics related to development, somehow it should, but somehow corruption and elite networks do not feature much in most of these discussions. So anyone have any questions here?
Yes, ma'am. I have a question.
Yeah, please go on.
So, sir, thank
Yes.
you for that amazing talk. As ma'am also pointed out, we would have genuinely liked to hear more from you on this work. But what I wanted to understand from you that the kind of networks that you are looking at, why is there any specific reason why you choose between a certain a centrality idea alone, or I mean, what was the reason that there were several other ideas that you showed from the morphology of networks itself that were not used to think about the idea of corruption? Is there any specific reason behind that, or so I would like clarity on that, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's a very insightful question, and I must. It also sort of reveals my own lack of knowledge. I'm not a social network analyst, and I only know a little bit about this morphology myself. But what I do know is that betweenness centrality comes up as one of the features, one of the sort of the consistent features of sparse networks. And so when you see sparse networks in the network analysis jargon, they will see a lot of evidence for a few gatekeepers, a few betweenness centrality entities, right? And then they also have various other ways of describing them. There's other term known. This is called sometimes structural holes. It's a little more generic than betweenness centrality, but structural holes is saying the same thing. There are certain people have to go through others to through brokers to achieve certain things. There's also in sociology this idea of the strength of weak ties, right? So there's this person called Granovetter who pointed out that if you need a job, you really have to know people who know other people, right? And so not knowing somebody may not help you, but they have to know others, right? They have to be willing to help you with others. So this is what's known as the strength, what he calls the strength of weak ties. So anyway, so all this is pointing to the same direction. I think that betweenness centrality creates opportunities. I didn't have time to talk about rent, but rent is like, a dog in the manger. Somebody who has a control over something and says, okay, you have to pay me something to to go there. So in the Straits of Malacca, finally, first they were just, raiding everybody, and then they finally had an arrangement. They said, okay, we'll pay you a tax, we'll pay you a rent for going through the strait. Right. So that's why betweenness centrality becomes important in the study of clientelism and therefore corruption.
Thank you so much, sir.
Any other questions from the panel or the attendees? Okay. So in that case, I think we can wrap this up. But I actually wanted to ask you a question since this is the time the book has come out, last 4 years. I don't
Sure.
know, sort of didn't ask. So I wanted to know, so you have been engaged in questions of climate change, political ecology, environment a lot. So how did you make this transition and decide to write something on corruption? Because it's a bit different from the conventional research path that you have taken. So
Yeah,
was
that's
this
true.
inspiration personally or anything that you saw which urged you to write this and take a look at it in depth?
Yeah, so thank you. That's of course an obvious question. I think it has to do with the fact that in my previous job, I was I worked in a research consultancy, and because of so in a research consultancy you do many different kinds of projects, and one of the projects which I accidentally got a good amount of money for was to work on corruption. And I was investigating corruption at the time because I was working with the power sector. And the power sector had a lot of, through energy, environment, power sector had a lot of corruption. So I applied for this grant and I got it. And we did something useful out of that. But the more interesting thing for me was that I learned a lot about corruption studies. And that's when I discovered that corruption has all these different facets. And there are people who are starting to understand it in terms of networks and social networks. So that's what drew me into the field.
Okay, great. So I think we can wrap this up, but before that, I want to discuss something about ideas. I think I shared a few brochure and the material with you regarding ideas, which is an incubation center here, which stands for Office of Interdisciplinary Studies or Interdisciplinary Engagement across Social Sciences. So ideas is providing an institutional space basically for cross pedagogical learning through sustained engagement with scholars who are interested in working beyond the contours of their own disciplines. I think the kind of research that you have been engaged in, you might find some of the ideas or some of the research papers that we do here in ideas interesting. So there are certain ways or certain initiatives which we have under this. So we have something called Solidarities, which is a space for collaborative partnership between community organization and the university, where we learn from peer groups and spaces. Then we have something called Grassroots Action Program, which aims to empower marginalized grassroots community through engagement in collaborative action. And then we have Molding Method. So Molding Method is a platform to explore methodological journeys of scholars and empowering researchers to question and adapt. So molding methods basically it meets the complexity of contemporary research challenges. So these are some of the initiatives under Ideas, and Ideas is offering two courses in development studies and development practice. So development studies in an online version of the development practice course. So it is starting in August, and we are also looking for collaboration and partnership, institutions or through individuals. So at any point, if you'd be interested for a longer association sometime, then we'd be glad to do that and take it further.
Thank you so much for that information, Abhi. That sounds really fascinating. I'll speak to my colleagues and the head of our department, Rajesh, about this as well.
Thank you so
we'll take
much.
something forward. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much for
Sure.
doing this. And if no one has any question, I think we'll end here. And it was a really engaging sessions, in the series of webinars that